Chapter 13. Love Once More. When she got back to her hotel, Emma was shocked not to find the Yonville coach. The driver had waited 53 minutes, and had at last set off without her. Although there was no strong reason why she should go home, she had promised that she would be back that evening, and she knew Charles would be expecting her. In her heart she was also feeling guilty for her afternoon of love with Léon. Going home this evening was an easy way of making herself feel better about what she had just done. So she threw her things into her bag, paid her bill, hired a small carriage from the hotel, and telling the driver to drive like the wind, managed to catch up with the coach just as it was driving into Quincampoix. She had hardly sunk into her corner when she closed her eyes, and did not open them again till they were at the bottom of the hill. Some way off she recognized her maid, Félicité, who was waiting for her at the entrance to the village. The driver pulled in to the side, and the maid called up to her mistress, "Madame, you must go at once to Monsieur Homais, something very urgent." The village was as quiet as usual, but when she went into Monsieur Homais' house, she found the pharmacist waiting for her, with a serious expression on his face. "Madame, I fear I have bad news for you. Your father-in-law is dead." In fact, Monsieur Bovary Senior had died the previous evening, quite suddenly, just after getting up from dinner. As Charles was anxious that Emma should not be upset, he had asked Monsieur Homais to break the news to her. He had thought it might be less of a shock if it came from someone outside the family. Although Charles's thought was kind, Emma was not, in fact, greatly upset, and went immediately to her house. When he heard Emma knock, Charles came forward to greet her with open arms, and said, with tears in his voice, "Oh, my dear." He bent down to kiss her, but at the touch of his lips the memory of her lover took hold of her, and she passed her hand over her face to hide her look of disgust. Nevertheless, she managed to say, "Yes, I know, I know." He showed her the letter in which his mother told him the news. Emma gave the letter back, and at dinner, out of politeness, pretended to have no appetite. But as he encouraged her, she forced herself to eat, while Charles sat facing her in motionless sorrow. Every now and then he would raise his head and look at her sadly. Once he said, "I wish I could have seen him one more time." She made no answer. Then, realizing that some sort of comment was required of her, she asked, "How old was your father?" 58. "Oh." And that was all. A quarter of an hour afterwards he added, "Poor mother, what will happen to her now?" Emma had no idea, and made a silent gesture. Feeling that her silence was the result of sorrow at the news, Charles made an effort to be more cheerful. "Did you have a good time yesterday?" "Yes," she replied. When the table was cleared, neither Bovary nor Emma moved. As she continued to look at him, she found that she could not pity him. He seemed a weak thing, a poor man in every way. How could she get rid of him? The evening would be endless. Next day, Charles's mother arrived, and the weeping started again. Emma said she had a lot of things to organize, and went out. Charles thought of his father, and he was surprised at feeling so affectionate towards him. He had never thought he loved his father. Madame Bovary Senior also thought of her husband. It was all over now, and even the worst of her days with him were pleasant memories. While the son thought about his lost father, Emma thought that only 48 hours earlier she and Léon were together, with the world shut out, drowning in love, amazed by each other's beauty. She tried to recover the details of that lost day of happiness and pleasure. She would have liked to hear and see nothing new in order not to lose a moment of remembered delight, but she found that her husband's noisy sorrow was driving it all from her memory. The next afternoon, when all three of them were sitting in the garden, they saw Monsieur Lheureux coming through the gate. He had heard of the sad event and had come to visit them. After he had expressed his sorrow at their loss, he said to Charles, "Could I have a word in private with your wife? It's about that matter, you know." Charles blushed to the roots of his hair as he answered, "Ah, yes, of course. Darling, do you think—" She seemed to understand and got up. "It's nothing," said Charles to his mother, "only a little household matter." As soon as they were alone, Monsieur Lheureux began to congratulate Emma on the money she and her husband would have now that Monsieur Bovary's father had died. "And as you are well again," he continued, "I was coming to make proposals for another arrangement." What he in fact proposed was that Emma should take over the responsibility for all the debts to stop her husband worrying. Then she and Monsieur Lheureux would be able to settle all the details. She did not understand, so she said nothing. Lheureux quickly added that there were some things that Madame could not possibly do without. For example, he would send her across a dozen meters of beautiful black silk for a dress. "The one you have on is good enough for the house, but you need another one for visiting. I saw that straight away when I came in." He did not send the fabric. He brought it. Then he came back for the measurements. He kept coming back, doing everything he could to be of use, to make himself liked. And every time he came, he reminded her that she should be the one who managed the couple's legal and financial affairs. He never mentioned the old bills, and she never let them enter her head. Charles certainly had said something about them when she was beginning to get better, but she had so many things to worry her at the time that she thought no more about them. Moreover, she avoided starting any discussion about money while her mother-in-law was there. But as soon as she had left, Emma began to amaze her husband with her practical good sense. They really did have to manage things better. She used a number of technical terms, spoke impressively about planning for the future, and never missed a chance of exaggerating how complicated it would be to make the right arrangements. Finally, she put in front of him one day a form which gave her the power to manage all his financial affairs. She had profited well from Lheureux's lessons. Charles, good, simple man, asked her where the form came from. She told him it had been written by Monsieur Guillaumin, the Yonville lawyer, and then added, "But I wouldn't trust him further than I could see him. These lawyers are nearly as bad as the criminals they work with. Perhaps we ought to consult—" "No, there's no one." "What about Léon?" said Charles, thinking hard. He had said exactly the name Emma wanted him to say. Now she could suggest that it was difficult to explain matters by letter, and she offered to go over to Rouen and speak to him directly. Charles would not hear of troubling her. She insisted. It was a battle of kindness. Finally she cried, "Now, not another word, please. I am going." "How kind you are," he said, kissing her on the forehead. The next morning she was off to Rouen in the coach to consult Monsieur Léon. She stayed for 3 days. They were 3 wonderful days. They stayed down near the harbour at the Hôtel de Boulogne, and there they lived, with the curtains closed, the doors locked, the floor covered with flowers, and iced drinks brought up every morning. Towards evening they would take a boat and go and have dinner on one of the islands. As they left the town, smoke rose up among the trees, and the red sun, reflected on the oily water of the harbour, looked like blood on polished metal. They went down between the rows of boats, and the noises of the town grew fainter and fainter. When finally they arrived at their favourite restaurant, she untied her hat, and they stepped out of the boat onto their island. They went into a small cafe with dark fishing nets hung up at the door, and sat themselves down in the low-ceilinged room. They ate small fried fish, followed by cherries and cream, and then went and sat on the grass. They kissed and held one another under the trees, out of view. They would have liked to live forever in that little spot, which, in their present happiness, they thought the most beautiful place on earth. They had both seen trees before, and blue sky, and grass. It was not the first time they had heard the sound of water and the music of the wind in the trees. But they had never really admired these things till now. It was as if nature had not really existed before, or had only begun to show its beauty after they had satisfied their desires. When it was dark, they started for home again. The boat kept close to the shores of the little islands. They did not speak, but sat silently in the back of the boat, listening to the water. Emma looked across at Léon. Her head was raised, her hands were held together, her eyes raised to the sky. She was beautiful tonight. Then Léon put his hand on a piece of red ribbon lying in the bottom of the boat. The boatman took it and examined it. "Ah," he said at last. "Maybe it belongs to one of the people I took out a few days ago. They were having fun, I can tell you. Ladies and gentlemen, with cakes and bottles of wine. I remember one of them in particular. A fine, handsome man he was, with a little moustache. Lord, he was funny, though. They kept on saying, 'Come on, tell us another, Adolphe.' Oh, Rodolphe. Yes, Rodolphe, that was his name." Emma shook from head to foot. "What's the matter?" said Léon, moving closer. "Oh, it's nothing. The night air is a little cool." "The sort of gentleman who has plenty of lady friends," added the old boatman. The morning after this last dinner on the island, Emma had to return to Yonville, and Léon had to get back to his normal life in Rouen. However, he found this difficult, and he started ignoring his friends and not looking after his business. Every day he waited for her letters. He read them again and again, and he wrote back to her immediately, remembering every detail of their time together. And unlike most memories, these did not seem to fade, but grew stronger. The need to see her became so great that one Saturday morning he ran out of his office and took the coach to Yonville. When he came to the top of the hill above the village, and looking down over the valley saw the church tower, he felt like a man who has gone abroad and made his fortune, and now returns to visit his native village. He walked down to her house, and saw that there was a light in the kitchen. He watched to see if he could catch sight of her shadow behind the curtain, but nothing could be seen. Madame Lefrançois met him, and could not believe her eyes. He had dinner in the little dining-room, as in the old days, but alone. He then went and knocked at the doctor's door. Madame was upstairs in her bedroom, and did not come down for a quarter of an hour. The doctor appeared delighted to see him, and, to their regret, stayed at home all that day and the next. The only chance to see her alone came very late in the evening, in the lane at the end of the garden, the lane where she used to meet the other one. There was a thunderstorm, and they talked under an umbrella, with lightning flashing all around them. Their separation was becoming impossible to bear. "I would rather be dead," she said, holding him, with tears in her eyes. "Goodbye, goodbye. When shall I see you again?" They turned back for one last kiss, and she promised to find some way of seeing him regularly, at least once a week. She was full of hope. She would soon have some money to play with. In fact, she was soon behaving as if she had all the money in the world. She bought a pair of yellow curtains for her bedroom, which Monsieur Lheureux had told her were a bargain. She had dreams of a carpet, and Lheureux, saying that to want a carpet was not like wishing for the moon, helped her to get one. She had begun to depend on Lheureux. She sent for him 20 times a day, and he immediately stopped what he was doing and came to see Madame. It was a dangerous friendship for Emma. It was about this time, around the beginning of winter, that she suddenly appeared to develop a tremendous enthusiasm for music. One night, while Charles was listening to her, she began the same piece over again, stopping 4 times, finding fault with herself each time. He, never noticing any difference, cried, "Oh, well done! Splendid! What did you stop for? Go on!" "Oh, no, it's too bad. My fingers feel as if they were stiff with rust." Next day he begged her to play him something more. "Oh, well, if you want me to." Charles confessed he had heard her play better. She kept hitting the wrong notes, and finally came to a sudden stop. "Oh, it's no good. I ought to have some lessons, but—" She bit her lip and added, 20 francs a time. It's too expensive." "Well, yes, it is," said Charles. "But perhaps it could be managed a bit cheaper. Sometimes a less well-known artist can be better than a teacher with a big reputation." "They are not easy to find," said Emma, and did not open the piano again, although whenever she went near it, if Charles was in the room, she would say sadly, "Ah, my poor piano." And when she had visitors, she never failed to tell them she had given up her music and could not now start again because of their lack of money, and they would say what a pity it was, since she had such a gift. They even spoke to Charles about it, especially the pharmacist, saying it was really too bad of him. "You're making a mistake. You should never let a natural gift lie unused. Besides, my friend, you should remember that by encouraging your wife to study now, you will be saving on your child's musical education later. In my opinion, children ought always to be taught by their own mother." So Charles again came back to this piano question. Emma replied bitterly that they might as well sell it, for all the good it was. But to sell this piano, something she had been so proud of, was an idea that Bovary could not accept. "Well," he said, "if you want a lesson now and again, it might be possible." "Yes," she replied, "but it's no good having lessons unless you take them regularly." That was how she managed to get permission from her husband to go to Rouen once a week to see her lover. At the end of a month, everyone said that she had made a lot of progress. Chapter 14. Debts. Thursday was the day. She got up and dressed very quietly in order not to disturb Charles, and took the early coach to Rouen, arriving just as the city was beginning to wake up. For fear of being seen, she usually avoided the main streets, going instead down narrow lanes and alleys until she reached the Rue Nationale and turned down a side street. And yes, there he was. Léon made no sign, but continued on his way. She followed him until they came to the hotel. In he went and up the stairs, opened the door of their room, and entered. And then how they kissed, and then how they talked. They spoke of all the worries they had had during the week, all the things they had done. But that was all over now, and they looked at each other with little sounds of delight and words of tenderness and love. The bed was large, with red curtains, and there was nothing so beautiful in the world as her dark head and white skin against the dark red, when, with a shy little gesture, she put her arms together and hid her face in her hands. How they loved this room! They had their lunch by the fire on a little side table. They were so completely involved in each other that it seemed like being in their own home, and they dreamed they would continue to live there always. They talked about our room, and for the first time in his life, Léon tasted the sweetness of female company, a woman's life. He knelt on the ground in front of her, and, with his 2 elbows on her knees, looked at her with a smile, leaning his face towards her. And she leaned down to him and whispered, "Oh, don't move, don't speak, look at me. There is something in your eyes so sweet, it does me so much good." And she called him child. "Do you love me, child?" And she hardly heard his reply, so wildly did he press his lips to her mouth. At the end of their day she would say, "Goodbye till Thursday. Thursday." Then suddenly she would seize his head in both her hands, kiss him quickly on the forehead, and crying, "Goodbye," run down the stairs. Charles would be at home and waiting for her, and at last Madame arrived. She hardly looked at her child, and if dinner was late, did not criticize the cook. Often her husband, seeing how pale she was, asked her if she was feeling ill. "No," said Emma. "But," he answered, "you seem so strange tonight." "Oh, no, it's nothing. I'm all right." But her whole life had become a lie, in which her love for Léon lay hidden from the world. Lying became a necessary part of her day, almost a hobby. One day, however, Monsieur Lheureux met her in Rouen as she was coming out of the Hôtel de Boulogne with Léon. It gave her a shock, and she thought he would tell everyone. He was not such a fool. But 3 days later he came into her room, shut the door behind him, and said, "I need some money, and soon." She told him she could not let him have any. Lheureux reminded her how helpful he had always been, and pulled out of his pocket an account of goods not paid for, more than 2,000 francs. She lowered her head. "But if you haven't got cash, you've got property." And he mentioned a farm near Aumale that Charles had inherited from his father. Lheureux knew everything, how big the farm was, how much rent it was worth. "If I were you," he said, "I would pay my debts, and there would still be some money left over." He came back the following week, saying that after a lot of trouble he had found a buyer willing to pay 4,000 francs for the farm. Emma was happier than she had been for months. But Lheureux shook his head and told her how much richer she would be if she let him manage these affairs. Finally he persuaded her to borrow even more money from him, and to sign a series of documents which she did not understand. He told her this would give her more cash now, cash she could use to pay her other debts and buy some of the little things she wanted. Emma, with her mind full of thoughts of Léon and what they could do together, did not even read the papers, but simply signed her name where Lheureux placed his dirty finger. With this money in her hands, she felt she might begin to be free. Freedom, however, was a disappointment. Despite her hopes, she now found Léon less pleased to meet her than before, less in love. Because she had more money in her pocket, she made more demands on him. But his employer was worried about his work, and his friends asked him why they could no longer see him. And the more Emma demanded, the less Léon wanted to give, and while her love, her need continued to grow, so did her anger. In the end, she brought roses for him from Yonville and threw them in his face. So Emma was not happy. Why was there this emptiness in her life? Why did whatever she wanted turn into dust? Everything was a lie. Every smile hid a bored yawn. Every promise hid a curse. To make matters worse, one day a small red-faced man came to the house explaining that he came from a Monsieur Vinsart of Rouen. He politely handed her a paper. It was a bill for 700 francs, signed by her. Lheureux had sold her bills to a money-lender. She sent the servant to fetch him. He was busy and could not come, and the stranger asked what reply he should take to Monsieur Vinsart. "Well," said Emma, "tell him I haven't got it. It will have to be next week. Ask him to wait. Yes, next week, tell him." The man left without another word. Next day, at 12 o'clock, a legal document was handed to her, and the sight of the piece of paper with the government stamp on it, and the name Maître Aran, bailiff at Buchy, written on it in big letters, scared her so much that she ran without a moment's delay to Monsieur Lheureux's shop. She found him there, tying up a big parcel. "What can we do for Madame today?" he asked, and he showed Madame upstairs to his little office. "What's the matter?" said Lheureux, seating himself in his big armchair. "Look at that," and she showed him the paper. "Well, what can I do?" This made her more angry than frightened. Hadn't he promised not to sell her bills? He agreed that he had, but added, "I had no choice. I had a knife at my throat." "What's going to happen now?" "Oh, I'll tell you what will happen, that's easy. You go before the judge, you pay, or they sell your things. It's quite simple." Though Emma wanted to hit him, she asked him sweetly if there was anything she could do to keep this Vinsart quiet. "Oh, no, keep Vinsart quiet. You don't know much about him, that's clear. He's more bloodthirsty than a tiger." Emma cried out that Monsieur Lheureux really would have to do something. "I think I've been pretty good to you. Look at this," he said, opening a record book and running his finger up the page. "Here, and again here. 3rd of August, 200 francs. 17th of June, 150. 23rd of March, 46. In April—" He stopped. "Anyway, I've had enough of these delays, and that's that." Emma said no more. What could she do? When she went to Rouen, Léon gave her little comfort. He had just heard that he was going to be promoted to chief clerk in his law firm. It was time for him to think about his future. No more love-making. Besides, it rather bored him now when Emma began weeping on his chest, and he had grown tired of so much emotion. Feeling him withdraw from her, she now began to wonder how she could get rid of him. She even began to wish that something terrible would happen which would force them to separate. She stopped her excuse of music lessons and her visits to Rouen. She stayed in her room, too depressed to pay attention when more legal demands for money came to the house, too depressed to talk to her husband or her child. She would have liked to stop living, or else to go on sleeping forever. However, she could not stop the world coming to her. and one morning, 2 weeks after the first visit by Vincent's man, Félicité brought her a piece of grey-coloured paper. She took it and read the complicated legal language which told her the simple truth that within 24 hours she had to pay the total amount of 8,000 francs. Lower down she read the words which told her that if she did not do this, all her household goods would be sold. What could she do? 24 hours. That meant tomorrow. Maybe Lheureux was just trying to frighten her, that's what it was. She went to see him. "Do you know what's happening?" she said. "I suppose it's a joke." "It isn't." "What do you mean?" He turned to her slowly, and then, folding his arms, said, "Did you think, my little lady, that I would keep on supplying you with goods and money forever, simply for the love of it? Be fair. I must recover my money one way or the other. Anyway, it's not me, it's Vincent." "Couldn't you possibly—" "I can't do anything." "But just look at it like this." And she began to say she had not known. It had taken her by surprise. She begged and prayed. She even put her white hand on Lheureux's knee. "That's enough of that," he shouted. "Anyone would think you were trying to make love to me." "You horrible man!" "Well, who's got a temper?" he said with a laugh. "I'll tell everyone what you've done. I'll tell my husband." "All right, but I don't think your husband will be very pleased when he understands what you've been doing." She fell back as if someone had hit her in the face. And then he went close up to her, saying sweetly, "It's not very pleasant, I know, but after all it never killed anybody, and it seems that it's the only way to make you pay me back my money." "But where can I get it?" said Emma. "What about all those friends of yours?" And he gave her a look so searching and so terrible that she shook with fear. "I promise you," she said, "I'll sign any—" "I've had enough of you and your signatures." "And I can still sell—" "Don't be a fool," he said. "You've got nothing left to sell." "But if I brought you 3,000 francs, a quarter, a third, nearly all of it—" "No, it's no good." He pushed her gently towards the stairs. "I beg you, Monsieur Lheureux, give me a few days longer." And she burst into tears. "Oh, look, more tears." "But I'm desperate." "I don't care," he whispered in her ear, so close she could smell his sour breath, and then he shut the door. Chapter 15. A Death. She was brave next day, when Maître Aron, the bailiff, accompanied by 2 witnesses, came to make a list of the goods to be sold. They began with Charles's consulting room, then went into the kitchen and bedroom. They examined her dresses. They searched through her dressing room, and her whole way of life, with all its little secrets, was laid bare, like a body on an operating table. Maître Aron, with his black coat buttoned up to the neck, his white tie and polished boots, would say from time to time, "Pardon me, madame, will you allow me?" And he frequently made little comments such as, "Charming," "Very pretty." Then he would make some more notes. When they had gone through the rooms, they went up to the room under the roof. She had a desk up there in which she kept Rodolphe's letters. That had to be opened. "Ah, letters," said Maître Aron, smiling politely. "But allow me. I must make sure the box contains nothing else." At last they went, and Félicité returned. Emma had sent her to look out for Charles and keep him away. Charles that evening seemed rather worried. She looked at him, then at the curtains, the chairs, all the things which had made her a little happier, but which would now ruin them. The next day Emma went to Rouen to see if she could find a way out. She visited every banker she knew the name of. Some of them laughed in her face when they heard her story. All of them refused. At 2 o'clock she ran to Léon's office. She knocked at the door, but no one came. At last Léon himself appeared. "I've something I must say to you," she said. She was very pale. "Léon," she said, "I want you to do something for me." Then, taking him with her 2 hands and giving him a shake, she said, "Listen, I want 8,000 francs. "What? You're mad." "Not yet." And she told the story of what had happened, how she had let Lheureux lead her into disaster, and Charles knew nothing. She must have the money. "How do you expect me?" And her lover would do nothing to help her. She had nowhere to turn to. "What must be, she said to herself. She was woken at 9 the next morning by voices in the square. There was a crowd of people outside, all trying to read a big piece of paper stuck to the wall of her house. "Madame, madame!" cried Félicité, rushing in. "It's a terrible shame!" And the poor girl held out a yellow paper which she had just torn off the front door. Emma read that all her furniture was to be sold. They looked at each other in silence. Servant and mistress had no secrets from one another. "If I were you, madame," sighed Félicité at last, "I would go and see Monsieur Guillaumin." "You would?" "Yes, you go. That's the right thing to do." She dressed, and, in order not to be seen, there were always a lot of people in the square, she took the path by the river. "Monsieur," she said after she was let into the lawyer's dining room, "I want to ask you—" And she told him her situation. Maître Guillaumin knew all about it. In fact, he was a secret friend of Lheureux's, and knew the story better than she did herself. As he listened, he smiled a strange smile. When she asked him for help with the money that was being demanded, he said how sad he was that she had never come to him before. Then he put out his hand and took hold of hers, and kissed it greedily, playing with her fingers and looking in her face with his colourless eyes. She felt his breath on her cheek, and could not bear it. She jumped to her feet. "Monsieur," she said, "I am waiting." "What for?" said the lawyer, suddenly going as white as a sheet. "This money." "But—" Then, giving in to a desire he could not resist, he said, "Very well, yes, you can have your money." And he dragged himself along on his knees towards her, shouting, "For God's sake, stay! I love you!" He took her by the waist. Madame Bovary fell back with a terrible expression on her face, crying, "I know I have fallen, monsieur, but I am not to be sold!" And she turned and ran from the house. Félicité was waiting for her on the doorstep. "Well?" she asked. "No," said Emma. And for the next quarter of an hour they went together through the names of all the people in Yonville who might perhaps help her. But every time Félicité mentioned a name, Emma answered, "Do you really think so? Oh, no, I'm sure they wouldn't." "And the doctor will be here in a minute or two." "Yes, I know that. Leave me alone." Rodolphe. She had to see Rodolphe. He would help her. But what should she say? How should she begin? Emma entered the park by the side gate and walked to the house. She climbed the stairs and went to his room. He was sitting in front of the fire, with his feet up on the fireplace, just lighting a pipe. "Hello? Is that you?" he said, getting up quickly. "Yes, it's me. Rodolphe, I want to ask your advice." "You haven't changed. You are as charming as ever." "Ah," she answered bitterly. "Sad charms. You said goodbye to them easily enough. Oh, Rodolphe," she sighed, "if you only knew, I loved you so." "You've been crying," he said. "Why is that?" Now she began to weep uncontrollably. "I am ruined, Rodolphe. I want you to lend me 3,000 francs. But... Hurrying over her words, she told him her story, to which he listened carefully. When she had finished, he looked sadly at her and replied very calmly, "I haven't got it, dear lady." It was no lie. If he had had it, he would have given it to her. She stood for a few minutes looking at him. "You haven't got it? Haven't got it?" She repeated it several times. Then she went out. The walls seemed to be shaking, and she felt that the ceiling would fall on her. When she was outside, she felt a little better, but all her memories, all her ideas seemed to fill her head and burst in a single flash. She felt she was going mad. Night was falling, and dark birds were flying into the trees. The sky seemed full of balls of fire, falling slowly to earth, turning and turning. What could she do? How could she face the world? She went running down the hill, through the marketplace, and into the pharmacist's shop. The door was open, and no one was there, though she could hear Justin, the assistant, talking to Monsieur Homais. She entered the passage where the laboratory door was. On the wall hung a key labelled Room 6. It turned in the lock, and she went straight over and reached up to the third shelf, knocking over a small bowl which had stood beside it. "Is anyone there? Who is that?" She could hear Justin walking down the corridor. She must be quicker. She read the labels, her eyes desperately searching for one particular bottle, a bottle which might give her a way out of this impossible situation. "Is there anyone there?" She took down a blue jar with a small, handwritten label on it, pulled off the lid, and pushed her hand inside. She took it out full of a white powder which she began to eat then and there. Justin ran into the room. "Stop!" cried the boy, terrified, throwing himself on her. "Be quiet, they'll come. They will blame your master for not locking his room." Then she left. They could do nothing to her now, and she felt a great peace in her heart. Charles had come back to the house just after Emma left it to find Rodolphe. He did not know what to do. He sent Félicité to the Homais, the Tuvache, l'Heureuse, the Lion d'Or, everywhere. Whenever anxiety for his wife lifted for a moment, he saw his own life ruined, his money gone, Bertha's future destroyed. How? Why? Not a word. He waited until 6 o'clock in the evening. Then, unable to stand it any longer, he went out along the road for a couple of kilometres, saw no one, waited, and then came back again. She had come home. What was the matter? Why? Tell me all about it. She sat down at her desk and wrote a letter, which she slowly closed, adding the date and the hour. Then she said, You will read that tomorrow. Until then, I beg you, do not ask me a single question. No, not one. But, oh, leave me! And she lay down on her bed and seemed to fall asleep. She felt a bitter taste in her mouth, and it woke her up. She caught sight of Charles and shut her eyes again. She tried to keep awake, wondering whether she had any pain, but no, nothing yet. She could hear the clock, the sound of the fire. Charles was standing by the bed, and she heard the sound of his breathing. Ah, it's nothing very much. Dying, she thought. I shall just fall asleep, and it will all be over. She drank some water and turned her face to the wall. But there was still that horrible taste of ink in her mouth. I'm thirsty. Oh, I'm so thirsty, she sighed. What can it be? Said Charles, bringing her a glass of water. It's nothing. Open the window. I can't breathe. And she began to vomit so suddenly that she hardly had time to take her handkerchief from under her pillow. He questioned her. She did not answer. She kept perfectly still, for fear the slightest movement would make her vomit again. And she began to feel an icy coldness rising from her feet to her heart. "Oh, it's beginning now," she whispered. "What did you say?" She kept moving her head gently from side to side, opening and shutting her jaws, as if she had something very heavy on her tongue. At 8 o'clock, the vomiting began again. Charles, examining the basin, noticed something white at the bottom. "That's extraordinary. Most unusual," he said. "No, no, you're wrong," she replied in a strong voice. Then, very lightly, he passed his hand over her stomach. She gave a horrible scream. He stepped back, terrified. Then she began to shake, and became paler than the sheet that she was holding. Her heartbeat was irregular. There were drops of sweat on her face. Her eyes stared without seeing, and she answered every question with a shake of her head. She even smiled 2 or 3 times. Gradually her breathing became noisier. Then she started to scream. "Oh, God, it's terrible!" He threw himself on his knees at her bedside. "Tell me, what have you eaten? For God's sake, speak!" And he looked at her with a tenderness in his eyes that she had never seen before. "All right, over there," she said weakly. He ran to the writing table, tore open the letter, and read aloud, "Let no one be blamed." He stopped, passed his hand across his eyes, and then read on. "What? Help me." And all he could say was the word, "Poisoned, poisoned." Félicité ran to Monsieur Homais' shop, and he came back as soon as he heard what was the matter. "Be calm," said the pharmacist. "What is the poison?" Charles showed him the letter, and the pharmacist realized there was little to be done. Emma saw the 2 of them and looked at Charles. "Don't cry," she said. "I will not be here to worry you much longer. Why did you do it? Who made you do it?" And she replied, "It had to be, my dear." "Weren't you happy? Was it my fault? I did everything I could." "Yes, you did. You are kind. So kind." And she passed her fingers slowly through his hair. "Bring the little one to me," she said, raising herself on her elbow. "The pain isn't getting any worse, is it?" asked Charles. "No." The child came in her long nightdress. She looked thoughtful and not yet fully awake. She opened big, wondering eyes when she saw the room and the bright candles. "Oh, Mummy, how big your eyes are! How pale you are, and your face is all sweaty." Her mother was staring at her. "I'm frightened," cried the little one. Emma took her hand and tried to kiss it. She struggled to free herself. "That's enough! Take her away!" cried Charles. After that, Emma seemed a little better, but then she began to vomit blood. Her limbs became stiff, her body was covered with brown patches, and her heartbeat raced. Then she began to scream again. She cursed the poison. She begged it to hurry up and finish its work. She pushed away everything that Charles tried to make her drink. He was standing stiffly by the bed, his whole body shaking from head to foot. Félicité ran from one end of the room to the other. There was nothing to be done except to call the priest. When he came, Emma was lying with her chin sunk on her breast. Her eyes were staring, and her poor hands picked at the sheets. Pale as death, with eyes like burning coals, Charles, not crying now, was standing facing her at the foot of the bed, while the priest, resting on one knee, was whispering his prayers. Slowly she turned her head, and suddenly, as she saw the priest kneeling beside her, a look of joy came over her face. The priest rose from his knees to show her the cross, and she leant forward and pressed her lips to the body of the man God. It was as if she kissed the figure on the cross with more love than she had ever given any person during her life. She then fell back onto the bed, and they hurried to her side. Her life had ended. Chapter 16. Endings. Death always comes as a shock, however much it has been expected. So when at last Charles saw her lying there so still, he threw himself on her, weeping. "That's right," said the pharmacist. "Let nature have her way. You'll feel much better." Later, funeral arrangements had to be made. Charles thought carefully about these and wrote, "I want her to be buried in her wedding dress, with white shoes and white flowers, and her hair loose over her shoulders. She should be covered with a large piece of green silk. These are my wishes. Make sure that they are carried out." The gentleman was surprised at Charles's ideas, and Monsieur Homais spoke to him. "It seems to us," he said, "that silk is a little expensive." "That's none of your business," shouted Charles. "Leave me alone. You didn't love her, so just get out of my sight." That night, Charles, Homais, and the priest sat beside Emma's body. She was lying with her head leaning over her right shoulder. The corner of her mouth, which was open, looked like a black hole at the bottom of her face. Her two thumbs were held tightly in her hands. The sheet that covered her lay quite flat from her breasts down to her knees, rising up again at the tips of her toes, and it seemed to Charles as if an enormous weight was pressing down on her. Early in the morning, Madame Bovary Senior arrived. Charles, as he kissed her, again broke down and cried. Like the pharmacist, she criticized him about the funeral expenses, but he became so angry that she grew quiet. Charles stayed by himself all afternoon. Bertha had been taken over to Madame Homais. In the evening, various people came in to see him and to express their regrets. He stood up and shook hands, but he could not say anything, and each newcomer sat down with the rest of the group in a big circle round the fireplace. They all looked at the floor with serious expressions on their faces, and although everyone was bored, no one got up to go. Upstairs, Félicité, Madame Lefrançois, and Madame Bovary Senior were standing around Emma, busily finishing their task of dressing her. "Oh, my poor mistress," wept Félicité. "My poor, poor mistress." "Just look at her," said the landlady of the Lion d'Or. "How pretty she looks even now." Then they all bent over to put the flowers on her hair. They had to lift her head a little, and as they did so, a stream of black liquid poured from her mouth. "Oh, my God! The dress! Take care!" cried Madame Lefrançois. Charles had to listen to the sound of hammers on wood as she was put into her last little home. 4 men carried her to the door. The house was thrown open, and all the people of Yonville crowded near. Emma's father, Farmer Rouault, arrived as they were bringing her out, and fell unconscious in the marketplace when he saw the funeral carriage. At the church, Charles tried to think about the few times when they had been happy together, or when, at least, he had been happy with her. But remembering that she was there underneath that green cloth, his heart was filled with black anger against God and against the world. They sang, they went down on their knees, they got up again. There seemed to be no end to it all. He remembered how once in the early days they had gone to church together. They had sat on the other side, on the right, against the wall. Outside the church, Charles walked in front, holding himself very upright. 6 men carried Emma's body, and the priest followed, saying the prayers for the dead. His voice was carried over the fields, rising and falling on the wind. Sometimes a sudden turn in the path hid them from sight, but always the great silver cross rose high among the trees. The women followed, dressed in black, and each in her hand carried a tall lighted candle. Charles recognized every garden as he passed, and remembered how, often on mornings like this one, he had come away from one of them and set out for home and Emma. Now they had arrived at the place where her grave had been dug. The people stood around, and all the time the priest was speaking, the red earth that had been piled beside the grave ran noiselessly down the slope into the dark hole. Then, when the 4 ropes were in position, they lowered her into the grave. Charles watched the wooden box go down until, at last, it arrived at the bottom, and the ropes were pulled up again. The priest took the spade held out to him by his assistant and pushed the earth into the grave. Then Charles sank down on his knees, throwing in handfuls of earth as he cried, "Goodbye." He sent her kisses and dragged himself to the edge of the grave, wanting to lie with her. They led him away, and he soon grew calm again, perhaps feeling, like all the others, a sense of relief that it was now all over. As the crowd walked back to the village, they talked about her death and what a terrible thing it was, especially Lheureux, who had made an effort to be there. "Poor little lady! What a terrible thing for her husband!" Emma's father insisted on going straight back to Les Bertaux, saying that he could not sleep in that house. He would not even see his little grandchild. "No, no, I couldn't bear the pain of it." "Goodbye, then. You're a good man." And, pointing at his thigh, "I shan't forget that leg, not as long as I live." You'll always get a bird from me at Christmas, don't you worry." When he reached the top of the hill, he turned again, just as, years ago, he had turned and looked back along the Saint-Victor road when she had left him to go with her husband. The windows in the village were all on fire in the light of the evening sun. He put up his hand to shade his eyes, and far away on the horizon he saw the place where she lay, with the trees, here and there, dark among the white stones. Then he went on his way. Next day, Charles had Berthe brought home from the nurse. She asked for her mummy, and they told her that she had gone away, that she would bring her back some toys. Berthe spoke of her again many times, but as the days went by, she stopped thinking about her, and Charles could not bear the child's happy laugh. Life continued around Charles, but it had lost its meaning. When Madame Dupuis wrote to him to tell him of the marriage of her son, Monsieur Léon Dupuis, a lawyer in Yvetot, to Mademoiselle Léocadie Leboeuf of Bondeville, Charles wrote, "How delighted my poor wife would have been," but he did not really care. Besides, before long his money troubles began again. Monsieur Lheureux's Vinsart returned once again with his demands. Now everyone tried to profit from Charles's loss. A music teacher in Rouen sent in a bill for 6 lessons, although Emma had never been to her once. A Madame Rollet demanded payment for delivering letters to Rouen. And day by day Charles had to sell the silver, piece by piece. Then he got rid of the best furniture. All the rooms were robbed of their contents, except for one. Her room. Her bedroom was left as it had always been. When he had had his dinner, Charles went up there. He pulled the round table in front of the fire, moved her chair nearer, and then sat down facing it. A candle would be burning, and Berthe would be sitting near him, busy with her painting book. Despite these efforts to keep Emma's memory alive, Bovary realized with sorrow that her face was fading from his memory. But every night he dreamed of her, and it was always the same dream. He moved close to touch her, but just as he was taking her in his arms, she fell to dust. And he was still in debt. Lheureux refused to wait any longer, and Charles did not know what to do. At last he decided he had to look in Emma's desk. There, instead of an answer to his problems, he found Léon's letters. He read them all to the last line, then searched through every other piece of furniture, opening every drawer, emptying every box. In this way he also discovered a picture of Rodolphe, staring at him from a mountain of love letters. Now people were shocked to see him so depressed. He never went out or had visitors. He even refused to go and see his patients. The only times he went out now were when he took his little girl by the hand, and they went together to the cemetery. One day, when he had gone to the market at Argailles to sell his horse, his last possession, he met Rodolphe. They both turned pale. Rodolphe, who, when Emma died, had only sent his card, tried to give a few apologies. Then he grew braver and invited Charles to have a bottle of beer with him at the inn. As they walked on, he talked about farming, the price of land, trying to avoid any uncomfortable subjects. Charles was not listening, Rodolphe noticed, and he anxiously watched his companion's face. At last Charles said, "I'm not angry with you." Rodolphe remained silent, and Charles, with his head in his hands, repeated in a flat voice, a voice full of endless sorrow, "No, I'm not angry with you now." Then he said a great thing, the only great thing he had ever said. Fate is to blame. Rodolphe, who had controlled the direction of this particular fate for some time, thought this was rather a weak, even ridiculous response from a man in Bovary's position. Next day, Charles went out and sat down on the seat in the garden. The sunlight came through the leaves, making shadows on the path. The perfume of the roses filled the air. The sky was blue, and bees flew from one open flower to the next. Charles felt disturbed, like a young man with an aching heart. At 7 o'clock, little Bertha, who had not seen him that afternoon, came to fetch him into dinner. His head was leaning back against the wall. His eyes were shut, his mouth was open, and his right hand was holding some long, dark hair. "Come on, Daddy," she said. And, thinking he was only playing, she gave him a little push. He fell to the ground. He was dead. When everything had been sold, just 12 francs remained, enough to pay for Mademoiselle Bovary's journey to her grandmother's house. That lady died the same year. As Farmer Rouault was by then too unwell to look after Bertha, she was taken in by an aunt. She is there still, but the aunt is poor, and sends the little girl to earn her living in a